Jack Parsons got me on the moon. Jack Parsons got me on the moon. Back to my here. Question 1 is frontline report. Somewhere in America, a veteran of Yahweh's commanders who fought Satan in hell. We are currently on a tactical retreat outside of hell. It was not a defeat, it was a tactical retreat. Barry Drillmore did not be defeated. No, sir, Barry Drillmore retreated with honor. We will go fight back Satan one day. I deserve a medal because I went to hell, and I tried to assassinate Satan, and he got away. And what would I do? So I could have been much worse. They tried to get me to be evil. I didn't even use profanity when I was in hell, though I should say heck. And no, this is no defeat. Barry Drillmore is a winner, not a sinner. Now, before you start listening to this broadcast, this blasphemous broadcast by this devil man Sheridan on the broadcast radio. Oh, hold on, as if the phone call. Hello? Story, buzzer me on, mate. How the fuck out here? Excuse me? Could you repeat that question and this time speak the English? Oh, I am speaking. Barry, you don't remember. Anto, we're down in hell. Yahweh's commandos. Oh, yeah, Barry, yeah, my old man Barry. Yeah, good Christian patriot. Yeah, that's me. I'm a good Christian patriot. And we had some good times down there in the hell, even though we veteran war buddies, aren't we? Yeah, Barry, what can I do for you, my friend? I'm a bit of trouble. I need some money for legal problems. Did Zog come after you, my friend? Yeah. I was fighting Zog, and I was a political prisoner. Tell me more, my friend. Tell me more. I don't know if you saw it, but there was riots in Dublin. Where I saw that. Oh yeah, they were fighting police and everything. Yeah, well, I was there. Oh really? Yeah, I knew you were up there for Patriots. Yeah, I was there fighting Zog. I'm in a bit of trouble. They arrested me for burning a bus. No, wait, no, sorry. Oh, I saw the bus burning on TV. So you were you're that consummation by fire, my friend. It was righteous. You were righteous to burn that bus. That Beelzebub bus. Beelzebus. Yeah, Beelzebus. Yeah, very but no, I did burn. Well, I helped burn the bus. I helped like Frano O'Brien to like fire rockets on the seas, but no, that's not what they arrested me for. What did they get you for, my brother, my patriot brother? Even though you're a patriot for another country, And I'm proud to call you a Christian because even though you were baptized Roman Catholic, you're not going to hell because you told me many times that the Pope was an Antichrist. Oh, he's a fucking prick. Yeah. No, but Barry, this is urgent. I need help now. Tell me, my brother in Christ, tell me what I can do for you. Well, I went down there with me, they call us far-right racist, right? But you know me, I'm not racist. Neither am I. No, Barry, you're not racist. Your daughter is getting married to Two-Clip. Yeah. He's black, and his name is Two-Clip, but he's marrying Chantel Chardonnay, but he's a good Christian boy. Oh, I shouldn't say, but he's a good Christian man, okay? So, with your Christian benefactories etc. installed. Please hear me out. All right, my friend. Well, anyway, I went to the town with my friend Martin, who's black, right? And we embarked on a revolutionary act by robbing Footlocker. The Footlocker to the sports show. Yeah, Footlocker. And we were joking that Martin had already been there before me. He fucking robbed everything. So much so that his nickname is now Martin Luther King. You know, Luther, L-O-O-T, or Martin Luther King, yeah. Okay, my friend, that's racist. I know, yeah, but anyway. He laughs at it too. He calls himself Martin Luther King. Anyway, so when I got there again with Martin, everything had been robbed. There was nothing in the shop. Except one thing, and I had to have it. What was that, my friend? There was a life-size cardboard cutout of Lionel Messi, the footballer. Which NFL team does he... No, not an American footballer. He plays soccer for Argentina and Barcelona. Oh, okay. I don't follow that faggot game. Well, anyway. There was a life-size cardboard cutout of Lionel Messi. And I said, that's fucking deadly. That would look fucking great in the living room. Beside the television when I'm watching Champions League or any shit like that. And there's Lionel Messi. Like, as a totemistic representation of the beautiful game. So, there was nothing else in the shop we were taking. So, I grabbed the 6-foot life-size cardboard cutout of Lionel Messi. And I'm about to go through the shop out to Connell Street. And there's big fucking red hands come on my shoulder going, I know, boy. You think you're fucking smart now robbing the shop. And I said, get your hands off me. I'm Lionel Messi's representative. He goes, oh, you think you're fucking smart, don't you? Think, yeah, you're coming down. And they took me down and they confiscated Lionel Messi. And I've got a court hearing at the end of the month. And for disturbing the peace and, you know, looting and all that stuff. So, you know, I'm a victim, really, you know. Okay, yeah. Anyway, what can I do to help you? We're on the other side of the world. I was wondering if you could send me some money. Well, man, I don't have much money, my friend. You know, Bar Drummond is under a lot of pressure. You know, it's rebuilding my life since I got back from the hill, right? And, you know, Chantal Chardonnay is getting married to Two-Clip. And, you know, there are financial things with that. You want to set them off on life, make sure they start out good. Now, I'm trying, you know, I don't have the money, my friend. Could you do something like sell a lung or a fucking kidney or a leg or something? What, man? Well, you know, can't you do that in American land? When I was over there in Miami, where? Oh, me and Deco Flynn a few years ago were in Miami, and we were looking for Antifa trans. There's no place in America called Miami. Mane, Miami. Oh, okay, you mean Maine? Yeah. Miami, right? I know you can do shit like that there. There was a shop and it said, "Are you broke? No problem. Sell us one of your bollocks." Oh, well, I don't have. I'm not going. Look, Barry. No, wait. You're Anton. Look, Anton. Right. I'm not going to sell one of my organs to bail you out. I need them all for when I go to see the Almighty. I don't want to be going up there with one testicle or one eyeball or one kidney. I want to face my Redeemer, uncorrupted and intact, and not like I walked out of a fucking. I will not use profanity. Surgical chop shop. Well, no, I'm screwed now. Look, Barry. Surely Deco or someone. Oh, that fucking. I wouldn't even ask. I wouldn't ask him for the steam off my piss. Now, surely somebody can get you the bail. No, I don't need the bail money. I'm out. You don't need the bail money. No, I'm out. I'm out. Yeah. Martin Luther King, he bailed me out. No problem there. Then what you want the money for? Me nerves, medical treatment. Oh, I thought you had that socialized commie medicine system over there where you don't pay for nothing. Well, you have to pay for this medicine. And what medicine is that, Anto? Well, I need some blow. You mean you got me up over here looking for money for drugs? What do you take me for? I've been clean and sober, and no fucking. Oh, where's my ears profanity to that catfish? Down Satan, and you called me up as someone who I thought was a comrade in arms, who fought Satan in Yahweh's commandos, and you is reduced from a cardboard cutout of Lionel Messi into a drug addict. I'm not a drug addict. I just want some blow for me nerves. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. I pray for you. Good evening and welcome to the Velocity of Now, wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you are, here on Beyond Room 313. Me, your host, Thomas Sheridan, on the first Sunday in December of 2023. The year's nearly over already. Sarah's been working so hard lately, and I gave her the night off because she's been really hitting the millstone, getting ready with the Christmas specials and stuff like that. We will be doing a Christmas special of Hocus Focus on Christmas Day, a festive one, a Yuletide one. And we're also going to be doing a Fortean review of the year on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, one or the other. I think New Year's Eve, going into New Year's Day. So I hope everyone's keeping well, and I've been cranking the Vons out lately, which is good. You know, people seem to like them and enjoy them. And this is, you know, a time of revelation, you know, not in the kind of biblical sense, not in that kind of religious sense, but in the kind of the expunging of the shadow or something like that, coming to the surface. And remember a few weeks ago I was talking about on Hocus Focus the
satanic panic behind the West Memphis 3 and those horrible events back in the 1990s, you had that satanic panic also happen in the rest of the world. We've all got to be careful about these satanic panics and witch hunts. There's people of low intelligence and also people who are demonically possessed themselves who feed and generate these satanic panics in order to cause mayhem, and they're usually the ones pointing the fingers. Cancel culture is a classic example of a satanic panic brought into the modern era. All these people who say, you know, this is a hate crime or this is invoking hate speech, they're the modern version of the satanic panic things. Now, in a context of this part of the world, in the English-speaking part of the world, in Europe, that's actually an interesting one, because the satanic panic that happened in England in the same period as the West Memphis 3 in the early 90s, they were all brought about by these Christian fundamentalist groups who went around with what they call satanic indicators, and this bogus list of if your son or your child or your neighbour or your workmate was into this stuff, there were satanic indicators. And they were things like playing Dungeons and Dragons. They were things like an interest in horror movies. They were things like even drinking and stuff like that, taking drugs. They were listening to heavy metal, of course. That was listening to goth music, what they call goth music, and dark culture. You know, that was a satanic indicator. And if you added all these things up with other, you know, then you had the legal basis to actually go after these people as satanic cult members. Now, you had all these, speaking of you look at the people who are the cancel culture types here. Nowadays, they're left-wing psychotics, usually females. If you look at the ones who are the cancer culture psychotics back in the satanic panic days, they were the same. Left-wing female psychotics, but they mostly worked as social workers. And these social workers who basically hate the working class, they generally tend to be a middle-class gig, with a hatred of the poor working class, unleashed absolute mayhem during this English satanic panic. Now, what they did should have got them arrested. But they were actually getting away with it because you had, in America, Geraldo Rivera doing a TV piece of shit, doing a TV special on Satanism, and Satanism taking over America and using the same satanic indicators. And also they show things like graffiti, so if you saw, you know, a Celtic cross on a wall or a pentagram, that was a satanic indicator. And then, you know, you see them doing that now. The old scene with the same types. They go after like the likes of Marina Abramovich without having any desire to look at what the symbolism of the art actually represents, the points that she's trying to make. It's enough to say she's a Satanist who eats babies and things like that and goes to Epstein's Island, even though none of this is true. It's enough for them to say that. Now, baby eating seems to be central to the mentally ill. The satanic panic thing, and I often wonder how much of this is projection. I often wonder how many of the people who go on about satanic pedophile, and you know, they say she eats babies under satanic Christ. See how many of them actually do things like burn their own kids with lighted cigarettes when they don't stop crying. I often wonder how much that is protection. I really do. And there was two social workers, two left-wing lesbian social workers in England in particular, picked on families in Rotherham, I think it was, in the north of England. Now, what they would do is they would take the children, they would grab the children, and then they would take the children away and then interrogate them. They'd get, because they were social workers, they were able to get a seizing order on the kids, and then they would bring the kids away, and then they would they wouldn't question the kids, they would brainwash the kids. So they'd say, they would eventually, the kids would often say, no, my mommy and daddy doesn't do that. My mommy and daddy doesn't do that. And then eventually they would say things like, one kid in England said, implicate his whole family in satanic baby eating because they promised him a helicopter ride. He'd always wanted to go on a helicopter. And another one was that a little girl had said that she'd eaten a cat, and her mother had given her a cat to eat. And it turns out that it was those pasta animal shapes. They're animals in the shape of pasta, and she ate a pasta-shaped cat. And that was enough for these crazy left-wing social workers, who today would be at the centre of cancel culture, and to have a whole community arrested and charged with satanic, based on nothing. And like you had Geraldo Rivera in the USA doing a satanic Satanism in America special, you had the same thing in England. You had like Channel 4 and other shows doing specials on Satanism taking over England. It's all bullshit, all bullshit. And like I said, based on the kids were a kid, and there was none of the evidence even began to stand in court or anything. I often, when you think about, it's interesting, it's always the poor they go after. It's always the working class. You can see how it's a class-based thing of left-wing social workers going after people they were claiming had satanic indicators. And in the cancel culture of today, it's the same thing. It's going after working class people who they accuse of committing, indictments of hatred against minorities. I mean, the recent events in Dublin, the riots in Dublin, you could see the middle classes in Ireland literally foaming at the mouth, finally having the excuse to express their hatred for the working class that they've held inside them from the time they were babies, when their mother said, "Don't talk to those commoners." And you hear people talking, you hear. I've really been very upset with David Icke lately after I saw him in a special talking about how pagan holidays are the satanic high holidays of sacrifice. He really, and he said it in no clear, with no doubts that he actually believes it. And that's like, one step below, but only a short step below Alex Jones flailing his arms around with his eyes bugging out and screaming about, the elites boiling and cooking babies and stuff like that, without any proof, by the way. And I'm sure that's happened through history. But this makes, people who are pagans like me, David Icke making a statement like that, it's bad for us, We don't live or think like that. And now lots of people who follow David Icke will now think that people who celebrate Beltane or Samhain or Lunasa are satanic baby eaters. So I wish David Icke would correct that. I wish he would actually, clarify that he's not saying ordinary pagans. At least I hope he isn't saying that. Ritual magic is the attempt to control powerful supernatural forces through the use of ceremonial rites, the concocting of potions, or the wearing of lucky charms or talismans, in order to summon up a supernatural power of some kind. This could be a god, a spirit, a demon, a cosmic force, or whatever the sorcerer chooses to call it. This is based on an analogy that connects man to the universe around him. I've been talking a lot about auguries lately and the understanding of nature. In our own lives, most of us, we don't need ceremonies or even beliefs to underpin important stages or moments in our lives. You know, unless you do things like getting married or christenings and stuff like that, or burying people, we more tend to use ceremony and ritual as an important touchstone in the marking of reality in our lives. Someone like who's a pagan or a working magician knows that these same ceremonial events, whether they could be soldiers marching past the Kremlin or past the Chinese, parades, things like what happened at the Cenotaph in London, that they can unleash powerful forces. That can be used for either good or evil. While you have a passive form of magic performed when people partake in rituals pertaining to things like christenings, birthdays, or weddings, or deaths, within the purposeful, magical, ceremonial world, these are done on purpose. And we've been doing this since prehistoric times. We've been doing it since the Paleolithic times, where, the shaman or the witch doctor or whatever would wear a pair of antlers on their head and dance around, while and being illuminated by the embers of a fire and the flames of a fire. This is where mimicry came from, the concept of glamour and magic, the concept of, flash. Transforming yourself out of being an ordinary human being by the use of costumes, regalia. And you see that, like, the way, look at the ceremonial rites around the coronation of an English monarch. It's pure magic. It's pure ceremonial magic. And that's what also a lot of modern art is. Yes, most modern art is absolute bullshit, but some of it is not. And some of it you can, I go to, whenever I'm around, I go to art galleries here, there, and everywhere, and 99% of the stuff there is absolute crap. Absolute crap. And now and again, occasionally, I will see something that just blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind. And it's usually something that has a strong spiritual, magical, or supernatural quality to it within the work. It's got this transformative, esoteric feel to it. And then you realize, you look into the background of the artist or their life story, and you realize that this is a person of substance. I think this is why most of the best contemporary art comes from Eastern Europe. It comes from Central and Eastern Europe. And I know you always have those jokes, like Saturday Night Live, sprockets, like that skit they did called Sprockets. Very, very funny, Hi, I am Goethe. I am from Stuttgart, and I'm as happy as a little girl. That kind of thing. It's very funny. But when that stuff is meaningful, it's really meaningful. The the Slavic people, they have a depth that's way, way, way deep inside, and I guess the Magyars as well, and the Ugarics and the Finns, and probably the Samis as well. That's deep, 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 deep inside. That they have to dive to a deeper well in order to bring it to the surface. Where in Western Europeans, our shadows, our inclinations, desires, fantasies are closer to the surface. So we don't have to dive as deep to get them. But it seems to me that in the Slavic world, in the Eastern European world, that these are very, very deeply, deeply buried. And this depth requires an enormous leap for them to go down and extract it and bring it to the surface. And I think that's, hence the work of Marina Abramovich. In order to go down, to find that, she has to bring what appears much more viscerally to us in the West to the surface. At least that's the way I see it. And it's funny, like, I have loads of friends from Eastern Europe. I have friends from Hungary, from Romania, from Poland. And they are different, they're different than my French or German or Belgian or Dutch, Norwegian, Italian, Iberia. They're different. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them. I'm just saying there's a difference there. But I think this difference goes, and people try to say, oh, well, it's communism. It's communism that did that, the Iron Curtain. I don't think so. I think it goes into a much deeper place. You look really far back into something like a heretical sect like that from Eastern Europe, like the Bogomils, right? They believed that the visible world had been created by the devil, and that all matter was therefore inherently evil. Because their rejection of Orthodox Christianity principles, they were accused of being sexual immoralists and involved in witchcraft and magic. And that's very interesting, because the accusations thrown at the Bogomils by mainstream Christian thought at the time is very similar to what you get thrown at people who are outside thinkers today. The Bogomils were in Bulgaria in the 10th century, and in that time and during the Middle Ages they accumulated a huge movement in the southern Balkans and Asia Minor, and also well into Western Europe. They were a very successful sect. Now, of course, it's Gnostic-esque or Gnostic-ish, but they weren't really Gnostics. They were something by themselves, and their doctrine, was founded on the belief from really ancient pre-Christian heresies. By heresies, I just mean, pagan religions, based on the notion of two creative agents at work in the universe. One was good and one was evil. Classic, dualism, Neoplatonism. And this made the basis for a moral code that made complete denial of the flesh. And their religious system combined an allegorical interpretation of the New Testament and Orthodox Christian beliefs into this kind of intense mythology. They believed that matter was irredeemably evil, so the actual material world itself was evil. And the Bogomils rejected marriage and the procreation of children. Now, does that remind you of, like, the whole thing of the climate change cult? You see, the archetypes are always there. That's why when I was looking at the Bogomils, I was thinking, gosh, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So they said they didn't procreate children because they believed bringing children into this world was evil, because the world was evil. The climate change nuts are the same. They don't want to have kids because they think it'll cause the earth to die. They forbade the eating of meat and the drinking of wine, and they condemned manual labour. Well, that's a lefty for you, isn't it? They opposed the established church, which is incredibly powerful, and scorned. They had a hatred of the rich and powerful, and a hatred of the material. That's very lefty, and you can kind of see where the roots of communism probably has a Bogomil, content to it. In Constantinople, they were tortured and persecuted, imprisoned and put to death. Now, we're also going by what the Orthodox Christians said about them. We do have, because the Bogomils later inspired the Cathars, and we do have quite a few legitimate Cathar texts written by Cathars and not by, the church inquisitors. So we do have a real understanding of what Catharsism was. The Bogomils, it's a bit more grey, because we're kind of, is this heretical church teachings, or is this from the Bogomils' own mouth? But it is probable that they did have those two separate sets of teachings, and the average person within the sect, just like any other modern religion, wasn't strictly bound to the code of sexual or dietary abstinence. And the secret interpretation of the Holy Scriptures, it was divulged only to the perfect initiates. So it's really, what we were hearing about, the most extreme elements would have been the priest class, like the monks were in Western Christianity. But they call them perfects, which is the same term they used for Cathar priests and priestesses. Though as the sect developed, as the centuries went by, they actually went the other way and were accused of vice and sexual excesses, as well as the practice of magic, soothsaying, and witchcraft. Now this is interesting, because this is one I do think about a lot. You have, say, a sect that is either, Neoplatonist in origin or Abrahamic in origin. They usually begin out as very strict, very orthodox, very Puritan. This basically works like an alchemical process, that by going into the orthodoxy at the extreme end, they burn their way all the way through the stuff and come out the other side as pagans. A good example of that would be like the Shakers. The Shakers are a Puritan sect in America. They're famous in Philadelphia, Shaker Heights, but they're in New England and Pennsylvania, places like that as well. And the Shakers, who are an offshoot of the Quakers, they actually became shamanic and had these shamanic dancing rituals towards, eventually. So they become so puritanical, so deep into the orthodoxy, that they end up becoming, magicians, soothsayers, and witches on the other side. We do have one account of the Bogomils that appears to be legit, though. A Bulgarian village priest named Bogomil, and that's where we got the name from. They used his name. We don't really know what the Bogomils were called, who preached that in the year 940. There was the doctrines attributed to him and another Bulgarian priest called Cosma, whose sermon against the heretics contains 16 formal courses to be pronounced against the Bogomils, is the earliest first-hand account of the sect. Nothing is known about the Bogomil. His very existence has even been doubted by some historians. Bulgaria became officially Christian in 865, and with the sudden conversion of Khan Boris. The majority of the Bulgarians at the time remained pagan, and the new religion was imposed incredibly fast. You have this is the whole thing, it's the same story with Christianity all over again. So some of a leader converts not only Christianity but also Islam and Judaism. If you look at the Khazars, they suddenly convert to a pagan country, and then they say, okay, you're all to join me. and it's usually forcibly done. And in Bulgaria, or this is why I'm talking about the Eastern European thing. The Orthodox Church there had to combat the older pagan cults, and then the other Christian heresies which have been brought into the Balkans from Asia Minor. These would be like the Manichaeans and Gnostics and all these other Christian sects that existed at the same time as early Christianity, and some of them lasting for a surprisingly long period, centuries afterwards. Bogomilism can be regarded as one of the series of attempts throughout the history to blend the Christianity beliefs and the dualistic beliefs, or classic dualism. The recognition of two independent principles of good and evil in the universe goes back way back into the early days of Christianity and the Balkans and Armenia. In the Bogomil version of dualism, there was on one hand a good deity called God. This is an invisible spiritual force, immaterial, uncorrupted, perfect and merciful, who created light. Now here we go, folks. So the god of light within the Bogomilian construct was essentially Lucifer. On the other hand, an evil power called Satan, or the devil, the deceiver, the filthy one, and this is the creator of darkness, physical material matter, and the entire visible world, including the sun, the stars, and the earth, human beings, the church, and the cross. Now, doesn't this bring us right back to years ago, me and Vaughan, back, 10 years ago, reading the Genesis section of the Jehovah's Witness Bible, and it talks about God creating the universe and so on, and then at some point in the creation story, this thing called "and then Jehovah God" Bogomils, they believed that the devil's original name was Satanic, as the older son of God, and that Jesus Christ was the younger. Bogomil dualism suffered from the earliest forms in making evil power ultimately subordinate to the God-good power. You get that all over the Abrahamic world. But this is another interesting thing. People talk about true Christianity, true this. There doesn't exist, and there was so much flux in the early days that none of these sects were written in stone or hard. They were just like in Judaism. Their forefathers. There was endless numbers of offshoots and other sects developing their own mythologies. By the 12th century, Bogomil books were widely in circulation in Eastern Europe, and some of these texts we still have. They still have the concept of Satanic. Then they mix Satanic with Lucifer, and then they talk about the angel who had fallen from grace, climbed back as far as the fifth heaven, and asked the angels as he went how much they owed God, and promising to reduce their debts. Through these promises, Satanic won over 1/3 of God's angels, whom he carried on his 7 tails. And there's another legend dating from at least as early as the 11th century, made the devil the creator of Adam's body, and God the creator of the soul. The devil stole the soul from God, but could not make it stay in Adam's body. He then wandered off for 300 years, and during this time lived off meat and unclean animals. He returned at the end of the period and forced the soul to stay in Adam's body by stopping up the anus through which it had escaped before with his hand. So basically, a religion based on fisting. You see, this is the thing, that these Christian Abrahamic sects, they always end up kind of imploding in all the things they claim to hate. And the Bogomils explain that this allegory of mythology of the hand up the anus to prevent the soul from escaping is why when a man is angry, he rages like a snake, a dog, or a cat. His soul partakes of all these animals. Now, this is shamanism. Now, the Bogomils, like their later, version, the Cathars, rejected the Old Testament for the most part, and particularly the laws of Moses and the books and the prophets, as their revelation was pure evil. Well, if you read those things, they usually are. They had their own version of the New Testament, which they interpreted freely, often in allegorical fashion. They rejected sacraments such as baptism and maintained that the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ were illusory, metaphorical, and not actual events, involving a phantom and not a real man. Not interesting, isn't it? And they also refused to venerate the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the reason why the Bogomils did not revere the Holy Cross, which they said was made by Satan, since Jesus was crucified on it, was an object detestable to God. And Cosma also accused them of cutting down crosses and making tools out of the wood. The Bogomils had no churches. They regard them as material objects, and therefore as objects of loathing, and no set form of worship apart from the Lord's Prayer, which they recited at regular intervals throughout the day and night. They condemned the church hierarchy and had no priesthood, although there is some evidence, at a later period at least, that the title of Dadets, or grandfathers, was used to indicate a rank corresponding to that of a bishop within the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Bogomils tended to spread eastward more than west, so they didn't really cross over the Danube into Western Europe. They continued to migrate back towards Asia Minor and became fairly influential as an underground movement in Constantinople, including, here we go again, the aristocracy. See, it's just like Scientology today. The elites, or if you want to call them, they're often seduced by these newfangled religions. The Bogomil sects were also different in different regions. Like, for instance, within Constantinople, they believed that the Trinity, they had a bizarre version of the Trinity, and taught that Christ entered the Virgin Mary's body through her right ear and issued forth again as a phantom. The belief was connected with the view that the divine Logos, the Word, in the beginning was the Word, was not eternal, but was spoken word of God, uttered in historical time by Christ in his teachings, hence the entry through the ear, so like whispering in the ear. Byzantine Bogomils also elaborated on their sect's demonology, believing that each man was inhabited by a demon, and that the demons particularly loved water, the realm of Satanel. Their Bogomils' moral and social teachings was the logical outcome of their belief that matter is evil, sexual union, even lawful marriage, that they particularly abhorred, as it led to reproduction of matter, babies, and they were accused by their enemies of shrinking from children as if they had a bad smell. I heard this before, that a Bogomil would walk down the street, and instead of going, "Dog is rat!" they would go, "Child is rat!" Serious, I'm not joking. Child is rat! As I said, they didn't eat meat, which they found repulsive, and they didn't drink wine, unlike the Cathars, who used to grow grapes and drink lots of wine. And this is because they believed that the tree planted in the Garden of Eden, or the tree in the Garden of Eden, where Satan, the opposer, the deceiver, had seduced Eve, was actually a grapevine for making wine. See, all the source literature on the Bogomils, like the Cathar, well, not exclusively, is their enemies writing about them. They were accused as being outwardly lamb-like, sweet, modest, and quiet, while below containing a vicious wolf. Well, that's like the New Ages, isn't it? Like the New Ages are all like, Namaste, love and light. I sent you light. And then, if you get on the wrong side, they're cauldrons of absolute poison, boiling, bubbling poison. The Bogomils were nearly all gone when the Turks moved into Bulgaria in the 14th century, but the movement had been declining for a while before that. This is around the time that they were being accused of being perverts and practicing magic and bringing back paganism and superstition and pagan rites. The name Bogomil seems to have been adopted at this period, applied to almost anyone who had unorthodox or pagan-like beliefs, all of which were obliterated by the Ottoman Turks. Now, what do the Bogomils tell us about the Eastern European character? Well, a lot really, because there's what the Bogomils were the shadow of the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and all these things that they rejected, these prohibition, what they really were the shadow of existence. The Gnostics had that as well. And the belief that, you see, this is what so many of the pagan writings on Gnostics are slagging them off, and for good reasons. The pagans were saying, this world it has hardship, but it's not a means to an end. So if you're a pagan and you live within a pagan understanding of the world and you die, well, you're going to be reborn back into this. It's part of the bargain. It's the reason why these trees I'm looking at right now have no leaves on them. They won't have leaves again till, March or April. It's the cycle. But if you believe in the Abrahamic concept that it's all ultimately for a form of external salvation, well, of course you're going to be filled with frustrations. You're going to be filled with these frustrations. So, if you look at behind the sort of like almost stoic demeanour that many Eastern Europeans have, you will find that when they do create it, it's like a volcano exploding to the surface. Well, it's the same thing with the Bogomils. They were the repressed aspects of the Eastern Bulgar or whatever culture exploding to the surface. And what did they turn out to be? Pagans. And of course, this concept of a racial or a group or an ethnic or a nationalistic or a continental component to the psyche that has to be brought to the surface is hardly unique to anywhere, both on a collective and a personal sense. And that's why I think, going right back to the Bauhaus movement in Germany in the early part of the 20th century, and even a little bit before that, the Dada movement in the wake of World War I, where modern art started out as a kind of shamanic convulsion surrounding the darkness of the European soul, or the soul of the West. The concept of God as the creator, but also the mysterious force that challenges us to expunge, to volcanically, there's that word again, volcano has been the strong augury archetype of late, to bring to the surface. You look at Buddhism, Brahma is the creator of the universe in the Trinity with Shiva and Vishnu, Even so, the three gods are personified as manifestations of something far greater, Brahman, the changeless, eternal principle, which makes the universe what it is. Brahman has been used by the Hindus to designate the god or the absolute. The actual word itself has a very ancient history going back into Sanskrit. In the earliest parts of the Veda, it literally means sacred utterance. You know, I've been talking a lot lately, well, for years now, about the Bhagavad Gita and the concept of Rirt, which is the root, a Sanskrit root of the term word, and it means to speak into action. Only gradually did the word come to mean the supreme principle of the universe. The sacred became also the source of all that is sacred. It became God. A development that was long and over an incredible amount of theological and spiritual challenges. Completely different than anything people would associate with the Abrahamic gods in the Bible. Abrahamic God, I should say. Well, sometimes gods. Within the Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible, God is given fact. God is the given fact of the religious experience from the first verse of the chapter of Genesis right to the last verse of the book of Revelations. The gods, Yahweh's intense and powerful personality is continuously present and stressed from the beginning to the end of the text. While a Brahman, conversely, works its way up from a relatively humble beginning as a sacred utterance, like just the mention of a word. It wasn't God who spoke into existence, it was the word that spoke Brahman into existence. All the way from that to the supreme principle of the universe. And even when this is attained, it never becomes, akin to a speaking or a commanding God in the way comparable to the Old Testament's Yahweh. It remains essentially a power within things and not the eternal power that issues commands and prohibitions. So Brahman is like the God force of behind everything and not the creative force in the Genesis sense. This is why, I stress in my book, The Druid Code, and lots of my other work, that although Christian theology edited the Celtic and the Norse pagan mythology and stories by using the comparative nature of Brahman and Indo-European or other religions, not just Hinduism, we get perhaps a more accurate description of how Odin, say, was the Allfather. I know that's a Christian terminology, but that would be like how he was pervasive, how the Odinist energy was pervasive in everything. In the same way that in the early Irish mythology and the early Irish pagan stories, the bow goddess, the Boand, is pervasive in the entire narrative surrounding the formulation of the text. The existence of a supreme power within Hinduism and the Vedas comes to be taken for granted, but no serious attempt is made to identify it. So the God force exists. It is manifestly attainable, verifiable, but there's no specific desire to write any kind of documentation or have any kinds of theological or religious practice that sanctifies its nature within the object other than it's in a given fact. In the early days of the Vedas, the the identification is things like the sun or the wind or the breath of life. It is food, but it is not the word. Those things, they emanate from the word. It is being and not being. It's everything and nothing, really. Around 800 BC, the philosophical text that closed the Vedas, that any form of identification for which Hinduism is known is undertaken. Brahman is Atman. Brahman is then seen as the self. The word Atman itself also has a long history, but by the time of the Upanishads, it had come to mean simply the self. It can mean either the self or the individual, or the self or the entire cosmos expressed in the self. So the concept of Brahman then has been incorporated in, by the time the Vedas have been finished. The concept of Brahman has gone from an unidentifiable specific force to meaning that of the expression of the self as the expression of Brahman, and Brahman being the self and the self being Brahman. There's a quotation, I'll just read it out here. The whole universe is Brahman, he who consists of mind, whose body is breath of life, whose form is life, light, whose idea is real, whose self is space, through whom are all works, all desires, all tastes, who encompass the whole universe, who does not speak and who does not care. He is myself within my heart, smaller than a grain of rice, or a barley corn, or a mustard seed, or a grain of millet, or the kernel of the grain of millet. This is myself within my heart, greater than the earth, greater than the atmosphere, greater than the sky, greater than all the worlds, all the works, all desires, all sense, all tastes belong to it. It encompasses all the universe, and it does not speak and has no care. This is myself within the heart of Brahman. When I depart from hence, I shall merge into it, into Brahman. He who believes in this will never doubt. Essentially, this means that the eternal, unchanging principle, throughout which the whole cosmos, solidified, but cohesively driven, and which made it what it is identical to a more inward than heart of man itself. So the internal self is both, like the cosmos, is both changeless and essential. One, both are immortal and they cannot die. Both are exempt from the passage of time, in the context of which alone death and birth and rebirth can have any meaning. To merge into Brahman then means to become eternal, to become one with the eternal. Brahman is essentially the god of the philosophers, the only certain characteristic of which is that he does not change. Hence, when it is said that a man becomes a Brahman, it means that he has passed beyond all change. Nothing can destroy this person, and he is therefore free from fear, as Brahman was. In the Buddhist tradition, it means no more than this. It means liberation from space and time, not of identification with any absolute, since Buddhists are not interested in the absolute, insofar as it was removed from experience. The Hindus, however, being, composed of basically metaphysics and metaphysical thought, are concerned not only with the experience of eternity itself, but also with explaining this transient experience in more or less rational terms. A classic maxim within Hinduism and Hindu theory of relationships with the human soul: whoever understands God becomes God. Now, while this trend in Indian philosophy to take Brahman, Atman identification quite literally, there is one eternal principle, Brahman, Atman, which alone really is. If this is so, the school of thought goes on to argue that all variety and multiplicity must be illusory. This means that because every human self is identical to Brahman, they must consequently be identical with one another. In such a system, you and I are meaningless terms, since there is only one abiding reality, of which you and I are. When all is said and done, ultimately, illusion, the absolute, single and unchanging, it follows that change is unreal, since not only our lives, but the quality of them are rooted in change. It follows that from the point of view of the absolute Brahman, they must be unreal and therefore meaningless. By definition, Brahman has no care. He or it does not care, because if he did, he would cease to be indivisible. Another verse in the later Vedas, this states that this self is impalpable, for it cannot be grasped, for it cannot be destroyed, free from attachment, for it is not attached to anything, not bound, it does not quaver, nor can it be hurt. Whoever knows this, these thoughts do not occur to him. So I have done evil, or so I have done good. Evil does not touch him. All evil he shrugs off. Evil does not torment him. All evil he burns out. So therefore Brahman came to be viewed in two ways, as in of itself unquantifiably the one, and it presents itself to the world, the omnipotent and the omniscient Lord God, who originates, sustains and destroys the universe. So you have the concept of creator, sustainer and destroyer. Now, the wokies will love this because Brahman is considered genderless. But however, sorry guys, there's also a masculine Brahman quality. But this is merely the creative aspect of the ultimate one. In contemporary Hinduism, the two personal gods, who between them claim the devotion of the great majority of Hindus, we all know Shiva and Vishnu, came to be associated with this aspect of Brahman. Now this is where it gets interesting, the tripartite trinity thing we see all over Indo-European paganism. So as a result of this combination of Brahman as the creator, Vishnu as the sustainer, and Shiva as the destroyer of the universe. All three of them, however, are manifestations of the one, the abiding reality of the Brahman. Now, this is why you have to really compare Indo-European theology with that of the European. Like, you think in the concept of Ireland, right? You have Ireland is represented by three goddesses, Folda, Bamba and Eru. Now you will find that if you went to the back pre-Christian times, that you would have had probably, now I'm not saying this is exactly what it is, but a similar concept of Eru being the creator maybe, Bamba being the sustainer, and Shiva the destroyer. Or, you switch them around. The same with the Morrigan, the Maca, the Morrigan, and the Bave. Well, the Morrigan would probably be the destroyer. The Bave would probably be the sustainer. And the Maca, the creator. That makes a lot of sense, actually. So when you start to see it, when you start to roll back in time, this mythology, what you come across is lexicons that allow you to understand. See, the thing is, it's always seen from the viewpoint of who is the god of European mythology, there's comparisons constantly with monotheism, which is what was done to the, when the monks wrote down the Irish mythological cycle, or the same thing with the Eddas, the Norse Eddas. And what that did was it just turned them into stories. So you have the way the mythological cycles of European pagan, ideology, theology, mythology, they're just seen as stories. But if you start to think of them in the same way that Hindus see Brahman, for instance, then it becomes a metaphysical basis. And the Brahman caste, I guess it would be, is based on the justification of what seems to be the grotesque pretension of the systems. It just for the purpose of materializing the symbolic nature of them in our mind. But ultimately, these are energy forces, these are thought forces. This is why this is one of the great disservices that this sort of neo-pagan revival that took root in Germany in the last century, 2 centuries ago, in the late 1800s, they turned literally Odin into a king sitting on a throne. He looked like a Prussian prince, or even worse, King David. When Odin, to the ancient Norse, was a force that would be akin to the wind, the scent of flowers, that the sensations of pain and pleasure. And when you see it more this way, you understand the omnipotent nature of it and why it was so dangerous to the Christians. Brahman has remained, quoting from a book of Hinduism by R.C. Zener, that than which one can conceive of nothing higher. Brahman is unseen, one with whom there is no commerce, impalpable, devoid of distinguishing marks, unthinkable, indescribable, its essence, the firm conviction of the one openness, the oneness of the self, beginning all development to the end, tranquil and mild, devoid of duality. Now, the reason why I went into the Brahman story after the Bogomil story is the Bogomils, you could see, were tormented by duality. This is the Neoplatonist mindset, the cathartic Bogomil concept of absolute duality really becomes almost like a mechanizing force that detaches from the spiritual self and leads to a very dark understanding of reality. Everything is either good or bad, heaven and hell. And this makes you understand when you read, the nature of Brahman, and then you compare it to how, say, the Bogomils, who were probably proto-pagan before that, descended into madness and then came out the other side as pagans. It's happening right now in Western civilization, when you think about it. Taking it more to this end of the world, what about Bran the Blessed? Now, Bran the Blessed, he plays a major role in one of the 4 branches of a collection of medieval Welsh tales known as the Mabinogion, in Welsh medieval tales, more probably dated around at the time of the 11th century, around the same time the Arthurian legends started to ferment, but originates from material that's far more ancient. Wow, it's way back. In the story of Branwen's daughter of Lyre, Bran figures as the king of Britain, but his divine origins are clearly discernible. This is why some people believe that perhaps Odin was probably based on a real king that himself had probably an Anglo-Saxon king even, or an early Saxon king that had divine qualities. Bran's discernible qualities in terms of his godhood. He's described as being so tall, so massive that no house could ever be built to contain him. So he's formless. He is just as generous, the possessor of magic cauldron. When we see that in the Irish stories as well, the Dagda, who's also shown as a giant, and who could restore the dead to life. Well, that's the reincarnation thing. A patron of the arts and a true king of his people. That's very much the Odinistic idea. And also Krishna within the Bhagavad Gita, a very accessible god. not living up there in the clouds or hovering in space, but very accessible. Bran's sister is Branwen, and unfortunate marriage to the King of Ireland brings us into a story of tragedy and black magic. The name Bran means raven, and because of this, attempts have been made to identify Bran as a raven god. I even did that myself in the book, The Druid Code. I rolled with that concept, which originated in the Victorian era, of associating Bran with the raven, to kind of tie it into the concept of the Monomythic of the Hindu world, and of course the Morrigans, which we spoke about, the Celtic world. In recent times, there's probably not enough evidence to support this theory, because when Bran and his followers set out to invade Ireland, the people go in ships, but Bran wades, carrying the musicians on his back. Bran acts as a bridge and hurdles being placed on his body to allow people to cross over from Wales or Britain, where it was known, the Brittonic people, over to Ireland. Bran himself is fatally wounded in the ensuing battle. He commands that his head be struck off and carried to the White Mount in London and buried with its face looking towards France. So we could be dealing with something that has a truly Gaulish element to it. Now we know that the head cult is central to European Celtic tribes, not so much Britain and Ireland, but definitely European, believing that the head itself was the seat of the soul and capable of life to even exist independently of the body, which is kind of interesting when you think of like the whole thing of like cryogenically freezing Walt Disney's and other celebrities' head, and the belief that they could be restored back to life by eventually stitching their head back onto a body when the technology allows it. These European Celts believed, well, we say they're Gauls, basically they were Gauls, that thought that a head had the ability to avert evil and could use it as a talisman itself, that the head had the power of prophecy and wisdom, fertility and hospitality, the Picatrix, and believed that it could move on its own accord. They frequently used the head in their religious art and symbols, the total divine being. Bran's own severed head fulfills all the functions attributed to the sacred godheads. Uncorrupted, a cheerful companion for feasts, in the strange and magic land which Bran companions find themselves. After 80 years, which is 80, have passed in the other world, one of the 7 men at the feasting opens a forbidden door to test the truth of Bran's prophecies, and at once the 7 are back in the everyday world and remember their sorrows, they are then taken to Bran's head in London, which is buried and facing France, as he had requested it buried there. The head becomes capable of speech, Picatrix, of averting invasion and warding off the plague until it is ultimately disclosed, when its powers cease. The epithet, blessed Ben-Gaeth, then there's a story. Now, see, this is where it gets confusing. This is where for years I had this problem too. There's really 2 Brans. There's a different kind of Bran who's known as the son of Fairbale, is connected to the other world, where Bran the Blessed and Bran's son of Fairbale, are one and the same, is still uncertain. It is a tale of magic in which a human hero journeys to the other world and remains there indefinitely, a turn and no kind of thing. The tale known as the Voyage of Bran was written down, I think, in the 8th century, and the theme of the story is very well known in Irish mythological literature. The hero is enticed by a goddess into the other world, and his adventures there are glowingly described. And then one day he is out walking near his home when he hears the sweet music and it sends him to sleep. He wakes up to find a silver branch with white flowers on it beside him, and he takes it to the house. There a strange woman appears and sings the wonders of the other world and persuades him to visit. When she leaves, the magic branch springs from his hand and into hers. He sets out with his 27 companions to look for this marvellous land. On his way, Bran meets the Irish sea god MacManaman MacLear, driving his chariot across the sea, which to the god is a flowery plain. The sea itself, a plain full of flowers. The deity also chants verses to him in which he prophesies the coming of Christ. Now here's the Christians, right? This is the same reason why the daughter of Noah appears in the Irish mythological cycle. Editorial time, and tells how he, MacManaman, will beget a son, Mongan, who will undergo many changes in form. This Mongan is stated to be reincarnated of the divine hero, well, Finn McCool, Finn. Many years pass, but the wanders in the other world, they seem to be but a brief space of time. Here we go, missing time, the Tir na Nog story. At length, one of them longs to visit Ireland again. They return. When they reach the shore, the homesick man leaps out of the boat and turns into a pile of ashes when he touches the soil of Ireland. Bran then relates the wonders of the other world to the crowd, which has gathered to look on at the voyagers arriving. Bran and his men then go back to the enchanted land, never to return. So you have this kind of fairy folklore thing going on. Even, the aspects of that could be thrown towards fairy abductions. The concept that you can never go home in a spiritual sense, that once you've changed as a person, like you think people like us woken up, if we tried to go back, people say, I wish I never woke up. I wish, because I was much happier when I was an ignorant normie or a sheeple. But if you go back into that world, you turn to ashes. Isn't that what it feels like when those of us, like tribal-minded type folks, return back into the normal world? It almost feels like you've left something more vital and turned into your soul, or your well, not your soul, but your enthusiasm is turned into a pile of ashes. These interpretations of the pagan gods being reimagined and sometimes degraded or portrayed as vicious, and you see that a lot in Fraser's The Golden Bough, can work both ways. An artist can satirize them back. Like, I often think that, like, Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel, he clearly paints, what's supposed to be Yahweh as Zeus. And him waking Adam, it looks much more sort of Greco-Roman, Hellenistic, Romanish pagan. The way his fingers are stretched out. Like, if you look at the roof of the Sistine Chapel, it doesn't feel Christian, it looks pagan. As if Michelangelo was satirizing the papacy back. Because, under rabbinical thought, from which Christianity comes from, you cannot, anamorphize God. He's unknowable. And here he is painted on the roof as a Sistine Chapel, clearly as Zeus. And it almost looks like, too, like Adam's spark, or the spark between Adam and Yahweh, is Prometheus stealing the fire of the gods. And the way it looks, too, it looks like a cross section of the human brain. And what we're looking at is, when I saw it, what I felt was I was looking at the Dodona, that famous site where the oracle of Zeus was located in the mountains of Greece. The priest, what they said, where the priest of the unwatched feet would crouch upon the ground, and the priestess interpreted the rustling of the leaves of the sacred oak and the word of God. They may have drawn oracles from the sound of the sacred spring in the grove to the echoes of a gong and the flight and calls of sacred pigeons. Later, the gods' answers were given through lots within the oracles. You could almost see that painting on the Sistine Chapel of Michelangelo telling the Christians that this is Zeus. And you want to take it a step further. Look at the design of the St. Peter's Basilica. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which was designed predominantly by Michelangelo, is what? It's a Greco-Roman temple. You just look at it, it is. This is why the Presbyterians in the Reformation had so much problems with the architecture of the Vatican. They called it pagan. Why? Because it was. So you have the Sistine Chapel with Zeus on the ceiling. So what's St. Peter's Basilica? The Temple of Jupiter. It's as simple as that. It seems to me that whenever the Abrahamics are given the chance, they go insane and become pagans. It's almost like they cannot undo. Like the greatness of the Holy See was a result of what? It was a result of people like Michelangelo and Brunelleschi and the rest of them making paganism great again. That's where the Renaissance came from. The Renaissance could have easily been make paganism great again. While like I read about the Brahmins and Hinduism, right, and how those concepts developed from the concept of the Brahman being an unknowable force that was only really spoken but not spoken into existence, on to later parts of the Vedas where it becomes more anamorphized, and then into the triptych, triune, triple God concept. It's an evolution of philosophy, right? And you get that in paganism. You have an evolution of philosophy. You don't have that in Christianity, say. You just have, like I said earlier on about the Shakers ending up becoming shamans with their dances. There was this group called the Doukhobors. Now, you want to hear what this is really weird shit when I heard about it a long while ago. The Doukhobors were a nonconformist Christian sect of Russian peasants that showed up in the just before the Victorian era. Well, it wouldn't be the Victorian era. It's just the late 1700s. And the actual name, the Doukhobors, is a Russian Orthodox derogatory term and means spirit wrestler, in the sense that the sect was battling with the Holy Spirit, not spirits, but the spirits, specifically the Holy Spirit. The Doukhobors themselves claimed that they were fighting alongside rather than against the Holy Spirit, very similar to the Benedate of northern Italy in Carlo Ginzburg books, The Night Battle. They said the same, that they believed that their shamanic practices, as they were actually for helping Jesus, not in against it. But the nickname stuck. The Doukhobors' nickname stuck, and just like Quaker and Shaker, funny enough, they were just Shaker and Quaker were nicknames too that became the names to them. The real name of the Quakers and the Shakers is the Society of God. Now, in a theological sense, the Doukhobors believe that they have their roots in the belief of Judaizers, which are a Russian heretical sect which deny the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. The Paulians, another Russian sect, who protested against religious formalization and rejected the Old Testament, just like our friends the Bogomils. The Doukhobors began, but it seems to be that the shift begins with the rejection of Yahweh and the Old Testament texts. You see that with the Cathars and the Gnostics. The Doukhobors began by rejecting authority of the powerful authority of the Russian Orthodox Church, claiming that the worship of icons and saints, the doctrine of the Trinity, and all forms of ritual, including the sacraments, were ill-founded. They regarded man as the living book and accepted the gospel only in a figurative sense. Later on, the Doukhobors extended their distance from the church by including the government in their condemnation. So they're right, because, the divine right of kings. And they would do things like refuse military service. at the time was compulsory in Russia. So they paid a price, not surprisingly, the Doukhobors, for their nonconformism, and they suffered horrible persecution in the 1800s, being deported to the usual places in the archipelagos out in Siberia. Tolstoy was disgusted by how they were treated, the writer Tolstoy, and set up a group of sympathisers which included the Quakers, Society of Friends, in England, who petitioned Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II, to allow the Doukhobors to emigrate to Britain. So delegations were sent and made by the Canadian government, and in 1899 the first immigrant party arrived in Canada, believe it or not, into the far west in British Columbia, where they were cordially received, apparently. The first of these were about 7,500, and there's about 20,000 Doukhobors still living in Vancouver, Alberta and Saskatchewan. The main concession that was made by the Canadian government at the time was that they exempt from national service on religious grounds, and their name was given as the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ, the Society of Independent Doukhobors, and the Brotherhood of Reformed Doukhobors. By the 1970s came along, most of the Doukhobors were living very similar lives to the Amish. In one strange way, women would expose their breast and vaginal hairs, pubic hairs. So they were, it's kind of strange actually, but they were kind of like shaman nudists. They, fair play to them, like the Amish, they refused to pay government tax levies, as they rejected individual land ownership. Well, you see, I wonder how much the communism stuff played into that later. They claimed to be pacifists. The sect actually got involved in sabotage, mass protest rallies, often in the nude again, belief bringing them into open conflict with the government. On occasion, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had to successfully deal with the latter form protests by the use of itching powder. How very Canadian is that? They would throw itching powder on the women to make them put their clothes back on. The Doukhobors are basically a nothing group in terms of that there's no art, no culture really, and they reject the development of art because they see it as a form of competition. Same with things like learning a musical instrument. And they're totally against formal education on the grounds that it creates conflict. They mostly reject written religious texts like the Bible and the Gospels. And they believe that in a kind of a Hinduistic term, it's passed by word of mouth. So it comes full circle, doesn't it? You know, the pagan comes back. They go nuts and then the pagan returns. They even have their own, they had their own kind of IRA group called the Sons of Freedom, which is an extremist wing of the Doukhobors, and have used subversive actions for years in Canada. I don't know how they've been in recent times. And they were trying to even get the government in Canada to deport them back to Russia. And this was communist Russia at the time, who wouldn't take them back. So the absolute, this is the Abrahamic sects. Whenever they try to take their religion to some kind of maxim, the same thing happens. They go nuts, and then they sort of fall back towards paganism. I think a lot of that kind of mentality comes from a sense of spiritual hopelessness. The concept that salvation is not possible in the self. That from the Old Testament, things like magic and sorceries have prohibitions on them. And even things like premonitions, which would be central to pagan religions are forbidden. The concept of a pagan being told that premonitions given to them in dreams or in visions was somehow evil or false, or today a form of mental illness, a psychological issue, would have been shocking, because they would have seen these noetic this would have been sort of like a visual manifestation of noetics. Not only did they know it, but they saw it. And you wonder how many tragedies over the centuries could have been avoided if people had paid attention to premonitions in the same way pagans did. Pagan armies would, if someone had a premonition, they wouldn't go to war, they would go to war. You know, no matter what the arrangements of the resources allocated to something, if there was a premonition at the last moment, it won't work by his trusted source. The emperor would even say, no, well, let's forget it right now and things are better. Back in the 1930s, this is an amazing story. We'll finish on a Fortean note, because we're replacing Hocus Pocus tonight. There was an airship called R101, and it actually ended its maiden voyage in disaster. For decades after, people who heard the name R101 would literally shudder, and this was due to many stories of people who were sincerely convinced that they had received premonitions of the tragedy. It was around just past 2 o'clock in the morning on the 5th of October 1930 that there was a horrific air disaster. The airship R101, buffeted by high winds and torrential rain, plunged its nose into a bunch of trees at the edge of a wood near Beauvais in northern France. I think it's in Normandy. And exploded into flames. Instantaneously, can you imagine what this looked like? 5.5 million cubic feet of hydrogen exploded, which could be seen for up to 30-40 miles around. The flames reached 300 to 400 feet in the air, and it lit up like daytime in the village of Beauvais itself. Amazingly, because the hydrogen burned upwards, 6 people, 5 engineers and the airship's wireless operator, survived the incredible fire. They managed to crawl away from underneath the white-hot molten girders. Imagine that. The heat was so intense that the steel girders that the thing was built from actually went white-hot. And even melted. And the heat was so intense and so much toxic chemicals released, as well as oxygen stolen from the air, that people literally could not breathe for hundreds of feet around. So much oxygen was consumed by the fire that people were having trouble up to, all around the site, for hundreds of yards, couldn't breathe. The rest of the poor crew and passengers, which included this guy called Lord Thompson, who was Secretary of State of Air, Sir Sefton Bracknell, British Director of Civil Aviation, and representatives of the governments of India and Australia, and all the top airship experts in Britain were all burned alive within seconds. Out of the 48 dead, only a half a dozen bodies were recognisable. The shock in Britain was incredible. And they gave them a funeral that was like a royal funeral. It literally left people in Britain in shock by the horrific nature of the accident. But it was almost like a ceremonial fire as well. Now, the R101, like the Titanic, was considered indestructible, the pride of the British airship industry. The actual thing was twice as long as the height of St. Paul's Cathedral dome. And the actual hangars they built it in Bedfordshire, were enormous. engineers and designers from around the world came along to see this thing and said this is the future of aviation. But yet at the same time, like the Titanic, many people believed the disaster had been foreseen well in advance through all kinds of premonitions. Doomed to the start, and even after the crash there was an extraordinary series of seances that seemed to indicate that supernatural forces were still connected to R101. The first indication of R101's impending disaster, according to the biographer of Sir Sefton Brackner, published 5 years after the disaster, Sir Sefton himself, he was described as an urbane man who wore a monocle, and he was lunching with a friend in Paris one day and suddenly asked, "Why don't you have your horoscope cast? Have you had yours done?" he asked a friend. "Yes," said Sir Sefton. "It says that I should be all right for 6 or 7 years anyway, and after that, says Sir Sefton, polishing his monocle, there is nothing to be seen." At the time of the British airship project was still in its early stages, and it had been decided to build 2 airships. The first was known as R100 and was designed by Barnes Wallis, who had built privately the second R101, which was to be built. The first one was built privately, the second one, R101, was built as a government contract. In this way, a diversity of experimental ideas, customization could go on, which the engineers from each project sharing and working together. R101 took off, and it was to have been flown its flight to Egypt and India. Mrs. Walter Radcliffe knew in her heart that something was wrong on the morning of 4th of October, when her husband, one of the riggers who was about to fly the airship that evening, went off to check the girders that were under his stewardship. They had a baby son, Alan, who was devoted to his father, suddenly ran in to her in tears and clutched her at the skirts, saying, "Well," she said, "what's the matter, darling?" He says, I haven't got a daddy, sorry. "But of course you do have, darling," she reassured him. "Your daddy will be back." In fact, Mr. Radcliffe did come back soon afterwards, only to say goodbye for the last time. Another person with premonitions. Was a guy known as the chief coxswain, a guy known as G.W. Hunt, and he was an ex-Royal Naval gunner whose experience in airships was second to none. Normally known as a jolly man, he was strangely stoic when he walked and just distant when he walked in towards the mooring mast, at the top which a giant silver airship was floated by its nose. It was the afternoon of 4th of October, and he was going aboard the ship early to see all was well. And with him was his wife, his baby daughter, and his 14-year-old son. As he reached the bottom of the mast to enter the lift, he turned to his son, whom he had been discussing the pros and cons of the boy's life in the Royal Navy, as distinct from the Royal Air Force, and suddenly, with a very serious look on his face, took his son's hand and said, "Whatever you choose to do, lad, look after your mother." Then he was gone. Some 10 hours later, 2 of the surviving engineers heard his powerful face roaring in the middle of the blazing gas bags, "Get out, lads, we're down, lads, we're down." He was never seen again. And for one young man, an engineer had flown on the R100 to Canada. Doom seemed preordained, however. He tried to escape it on that fateful day. Certain of disaster, he refused to fly with R101, and he watched her leave the mast, and then rode off on his motorbike. A short time afterwards, he crashed head-on into a lorry and died instantly. So just think about that. He knew he would die if he would go on that airship, and then was killed on driving away from it to try and save himself. The great airship left its mast on time to the cheers of a crowd below, and it passed over North London. Hundreds of people came out into the streets to see the dark shape against the evening sky, the lights of her cockpit glittering and her navigation lights flashing green and red. As the night went on, the airship crossed the English Channel, and was the weather worsened, Flight Lieutenant Carmichael Irwin, the captain, and his officers began to feel really uneasy about things. The craft was rolling more and more like it never done before, and the ship neared the bivouac. Engine trouble caused more. Worried. At Cardington, the night duty officer was dozing in his chair when he suddenly heard the click up from the switchboard panel, which meant that someone was making a call from inside the building. He looked up and startled, for he and a colleague were the only people on duty, and he saw the light indicator drop down and bore the name Flight Lieutenant Irwin. He pushed it up again, thinking it slipped accidentally, but it dropped down again and again and again. The duty officer called his colleagues, and together they set off to Flight Lieutenant's office, convinced that someone had broken in. The office was empty, the telephone had not been interfered with, and no satisfactory explanation has ever been discovered. But the two men noticed at the time of the incident occurred, the office clock stood at 5 minutes past 2, the moment that the airship R101 had exploded. On Tuesday, October 8, 3 days after this disaster, the psychical researcher Harry Price, an old friend of Hocus Pocus, and the medium Mrs. Eileen Garnett were holding a small séance in London. Neither Mr. Price nor Mrs. Garnett knew very much about airships or 101, although both of the course had read about the crash in the newspapers. Suddenly, Mrs. Garnett was deep in a trance and began to speak in a man's voice and mentioned the name Irving or Irwin. The name was recognised by everyone present, but the voice went rapidly on, listing the technical details which were at the time known only to the survivors. The full details did not appear in print until the following year, at the inquiry in April 1931. Price sent a copy of the spirit message to the authorities, but no more was heard about it. An even more interesting séance took place. 3 weeks after that, the investigator being a Major Owen Villiers, who had been a close friend of Sir Sefton Brackner and Flight Lieutenant Irwin. Major Villiers, though not a medium himself, suddenly had an overpowering sensation that Irwin was near him. Feeling certain that the dead man wished to speak to him, Villiers went in search of a medium and was eventually introduced to Mrs. Garnett, the same one, who agreed to try a series of séances with him. Major Villiers was convinced that the voices which spoke to him using personal expressions which Mrs. Garnett could not have known were those of Irving, Brackner, Major G. H. Scott, an official with the Royal Airship Works, and Royal Squadron Leader E. L. Johnson, the navigator. Irwin's first words, according to the transcripts, which Major Villiers made available to the author James Lacer when he was writing the book on the disaster, The Millionth Chance, where "we feel like damn murderers. It's awful, old man, awful. We ought to have said no." Irwin then went on to describe in great detail how the airship crashed, how a gas valve had been blown out at the same time the engine backfired, and how the explosion had occurred. A clue to the explanation of Irwin's words about feeling like a murderer perhaps lies in a story told by one of his friends, also an airship commander, who heard of the disaster in the early hours of the 5th of October and went to break the tragic news to Irving's widow. When he arrived, Mrs. Irving had already standing white-faced on the porch. "It's all right," she said. "You needn't worry, I know. You see, Bird is Irish and I'm Scottish. We both knew he wasn't coming back." There was nothing more to be said. It's just incredible stuff, and it's very interesting that the Celtic people at the end automatically knew it. As Lovecraft says, the Celtics' far vision of strange things. Even the way the airship blew up, it's almost like an alchemical transformation. When R101 went up like that, the souls on board were probably blasted into another reality by the intensity of the heat and the sheer spectacular, if you can use such a word, nature of the event. But they went on board because it was their duty. Now, in pagan times, if we were still pagans, and the commanding officer was a pagan, and people came to it premonitions that the airship is going to blow up when it reaches the French coast, they would have said, "We're not flying, lads, we're not going." And that's probably why the ghosts or spirits of the ones who were killed said, "We feel like murderers." So, I hope you enjoyed tonight's distraction from, substitution of Hocus Focus. Sarah and myself will be back next weekend on her channel. And have a great week. I hope you enjoyed this fill-in. I certainly have. And feck 'em if they can't take a joke.